Thank you. With that kind of reception, I'm tempted to quit while I'm ahead. Thank you for that introduction. I'm not sure what adjective to use. There are kind introductions and there are nice introductions. The nice ones are where they list all your achievements. They get your talk transcribed and they send a copy notarized to your mother. The kind introductions are where they leave stuff out, and that was a distinctly unkind introduction. I mean, did you really have to mention the Mondale part? People ask me, how do you go from Walter Mondale to Fox News? And I tell them the answer is simple. I was young once. Well, now that I've offended all the liberals in the room, you did also make sure to include the part about psychiatry, and I noticed the reaction of the audience. Hilarity. Now, it is true that I used to be a psychiatrist. In fact, technically I still am. But in reality, I'm a psychiatrist in remission. Doing very well, thank you. I haven't had a relapse in 25 years. Of course, I'm asked to compare what I do today as a political analyst in Washington with what I used to do as a psychiatrist in Boston. Don't get ahead of me now. Of course, I tell them that they're really not that different. In both lines of work, I deal every day with people who suffer from paranoia and delusions of grandeur. Sometimes they run for president. I figure by now I've offended 2/3 of the room. So 1/3 to go, and we'll be complete. The only difference is between the paranoids I encounter in Washington and those in Boston is that the ones in Washington have access to nuclear weapons. Makes the stakes a little higher, the work a little more interesting. I'm very happy to be here, even though I'm not quite sure what time zone I'm in. And I'll be going home right away after this to Washington. So if you see me tomorrow on Special Report, I'll be completely out of it. I'm very happy to be here. Second time, as you mentioned, for the Washington Policy Center, 6 years ago. I really admire the work you do. It is very important. It's exactly the kind of fact-based, argument-based policy advocacy that is rare to find. This is one of the most distinguished state think tanks, again, unusual in the country, and they do great things, and I commend you for supporting their work. So I'm happy to be here. I'm genuinely happy to be out here helping to support your work. Happy to be in the West Coast, which I love, where my son lives. But the truth be told, I'm happy to be anywhere where Bill O'Reilly can't interrupt me. During the photo op, some of you were very kind, and you graciously told me that I'm your guest every night at the dinner table. Johnny Carson once said that it was humbling to realize that every night 20 million people are watching you between their feet. So at least you're sitting when you see me. And I thank you for mentioning the book. When it first came out, it did rather well. And I got a call one day about 2 months into the publication, somebody who said she was a reporter for Newsweek. I didn't know that Newsweek still existed, but apparently it enjoys a posthumous existence on the web. She said, my editor asked me to do a story on the unexpected success of your book. I thought to myself, that's not a very promising premise for an interview. Nonetheless, I soldiered on, and she asked if I could explain its success, and I decided to play humble and self-deprecating, which, as those of you who watch me on Fox know, does not come very easily. So I said, oh, shucks, I don't know, maybe you should just call around, ask people what they think. So I didn't hear from her for a few weeks, and finally a friend calls and says, did you see the story about you in Newsweek? I said, no. He said, let me read you the first sentence. Charles Krauthammer's Things That Matter is flying off the shelves, and no one has any idea why. That's the last time I play humble and self-deprecating. But I digress, and I haven't even started. This is a very crazy political year. You didn't have to bring me all the way from Washington to tell you that. But I am impressed by how crazy. I've been in the politics business in Washington for 35 years, and I have never seen anything like it. Now, of course, I do have a professional advantage that in the old days, when I was at the Massachusetts General Hospital, I worked in the locked psychiatric ward. So I have been in a place where around once a day I have to remind myself that I'm the sane one. So tonight's lecture is premised on the assumption that I'm the sane one. We'll see how far that takes us. Now, the first thing you've noticed about this election that is very well known is that it sports the two most unpopular candidates in polling history in the United States of America. That's not easy to do. This is a big country. And to get the most unpopular for both of the parties is quite an achievement. We can start with Hillary, whom I remember saying 2 years ago, long before the fall, that she was a very weak candidate. She starts out with more baggage than Delta Airlines. And then, because that appeared to be insufficient, she adds on the email stuff. I mean, the plane can hardly get off the ground. She's such a weak candidate that, as you all witnessed, for about a year, she was unable to shake a challenge from Bernie Sanders, a 74-year-old Brooklynite socialist who honeymooned in the Soviet Union. That is a fact. And as Lindsey Graham said, my favorite senator, yes, and he never returned. I never had high hopes for her candidacy, that she would be very successful. And then the first thing that happened, even before she declared, remember, she came out with a book about her time as Secretary of State. She did her first interview with Diane Sawyer, in which she said that when she and her husband left the White House, they were broke, and they had trouble paying the mortgages on their homes. Now, you'll notice, Politics 101, when pleading poverty, it is not a good idea to refer to your domiciles in the plural. My second confirmation about my instincts about the weakness of her candidacy was when the email story broke earlier this year. And I remember it was a Friday, we went on special report, and just in the afternoon, her spokesman had said that there was not a shred of evidence that she had done anything wrong. To which I couldn't resist saying on the air, well, of course, that's because she shredded the evidence. For a political commentator, that is just gold. That's a hanging curveball. To look at the serious side, I mean, she obviously has the personality problems. We know that her, did you see yesterday? I just saw it on the air this afternoon. The guy who's running for governor in Florida, former governor, used to be a Republican, then independent. He was in a debate last night, and I saw a clip of it in which he was asked why he's supporting Hillary Clinton. And he said, because she's experienced, and I like her honesty. The audience burst out laughing. She has so many strikes against her. It's the baggage, it's the honesty factor, it's the fact that she has trouble telling lies. I mean, she tells them routinely, but she has trouble telling them well. She needs to take lessons from her husband, who is one of the great liars and most charming liars in American history. I try to avoid that. My motto in life is, tell the truth, it's easier to memorize. She can't memorize it. But apart from all that, let's put the personality stuff, the lack of political skills apart. She has one main problem with her campaign. It doesn't stand for anything. She doesn't have a message. People say, well, she's having trouble getting her message out. She doesn't have a message. Ask yourself, what would she do as president? Nobody knows, because she doesn't know. It's sort of one of the casualties of dynastic politics. Ted Kennedy had the same problem. You could even say that Jeb Bush, whom I happen to like, had the same problem. When you're expected to ascend to office because of your pedigree, you have to talk yourself into why you're doing it. Ronald Reagan knew what he wanted to do. Barack Obama knew what he wanted to do. Conviction politicians, you can summarize what they want to do in a sentence or two, and they really want to do it. The only reason she's running is because she is supposed to, because it's the next rung on the ladder, because she's been preparing all her life. And that's why she cannot get any traction. She can still win because of the built-in advantages that Democrats have in any presidential election. The demographic advantages, the advantages in terms of the electoral college and all that. But she's a very weak candidate, not just because of skills or history or mendacity, but because there's no theme to that pudding, to quote Winston Churchill. On the other hand, Donald Trump, who has his own personality issues, there goes another 20% of the audience. He stands for things. You may not like it, you may not like his prescriptions, I don't, but he does stand for things. You know why he's running, you know what he wants to do. America first, he believes the country has been done badly by others in trade and immigration. He's got ideas. And that is clearly what has attracted the following he has gotten. But that seems to me to be his major advantage. Now, so you've got two candidates. I mean, Trump's problem is that the personality defects, if I can put it that way, without being psychiatric, is, I actually wrote a column. It's the only time in the 35 years I've been a columnist where I broke my rule about never psychologizing about people in public office. I was just impelled. I couldn't help myself. The column wrote itself. I read it and I liked it. I mean, he's got a few problems with sort of basic political knowledge. He was in a meeting. I'll try to get through this with a straight face. He was in a meeting, one of his early meetings to make the peace with the congressional wing of the party. He was asked by one of the congressmen, closed doors, but of course nothing in Washington. His secret was immediately leaked. He was asked what he thought about the Article 1 powers. And his response was, I believe in all of them. Article 1, Article 2, Article 9, Article 12. There are only 7. I mean, it's okay. And then he had the contretemps with Megyn Kelly, John McCain, and others. But nonetheless, I want to go back to understanding why he's been such a success. Because this is totally improbable. This is totally insane to nominate somebody with so little knowledge and experience. But nonetheless, he just came like a tsunami out of nowhere. And that's because he was able to diagnose with incredible intuition what the party had overlooked. And I think he honed in on the fact that the middle class had sort of been neglected by, I wouldn't say deliberately neglected, but the party as a conservative party was looking at other items and did not quite appreciate how things like globalization, free trade, which are goods in and of themselves are good, immigration, which overall net is a good, but how the way they've been handled, the way they have been mismanaged, has left a vast swath of the middle class feeling that they've been abandoned. And as a result, also a whole swath of American, I don't want to use the word ethnic, but in the identity politics of the country, a white working class had been completely left behind. And he was able to appeal to them. It was the source of his appeal as a Republican running for the nomination, and it remains the core source of his appeal in the general election. But there's one big liability. He's not a conservative. The GOP is the conservative party. What makes this the craziest election and the most unusual is that for the first time in 50 years, we have a general election in which neither candidate is conservative. I don't think any people have appreciated how profound that fact is. Trump goes ad hoc. He supports certain things in a way that is not traditionally conservative. Just last week, he unveiled Ivanka Care, which was a child care program that outdoes Bernie Sanders, an entirely new entitlement as the front runner for a party, as the nominee for a party that believes in controlling entitlements, and that unless they're controlled, in the end, our economy is going to go down the tubes. Trump does not only refuse to contemplate touching entitlements, which we are going to have to do eventually, but was proposing to add one. So we have this really odd situation where we're running on one side, the Democratic side, a classic liberal who is somewhere between Barack Obama, Bernie Sanders, and a pure socialist, European-type socialist. And on the other side, a former Democrat who has all the Democratic instincts and who yet has found a way to appeal to a huge constituency of former Democrats, some former Republican, with this appeal to give them the attention and the care that the so-called elites have abandoned. And the three elements of Trumpism are immigration, trade, and sort of non-intervention abroad. All three of them very openly contrary to conservative orthodoxy. Basically what he is a populist, which is not the same as a conservative. And it's a real challenge for the party what it will evolve into. After November, we're going to have a real struggle. The party is going to have to redefine itself. Either reject this kind of populism, and that would happen if Trump lost badly. But if he loses in a close election, or obviously if he wins, then he could transform the Republican Party into a populist party, abandoning its roots as a conservative party. Now, in that sense, I think he's done a service by bringing out into the forefront and showing concern for and pushing the party into examining the dilemmas and the anxieties, particularly of the working class, white working class, and also the middle class, which has been squeezed now for 20 years. My problem with Trump is that he blames it all on foreigners, trade and immigration, and I said so. In fact, the day he announced, last June 16, you don't remember the date because you have real lives. I, for my sins, have to follow these folks day and night and annotate their various ravings. Clearly, my sins are many. So June 16th, he makes his announcement. Remember the escalator ride? Came down. And he said this stuff about Mexicans that had me so floored, I wanted to say so, but I had to go back to the internet to see a transcript to make sure I hadn't heard it incorrectly. I love the part where he said, they're bringing in crime, they're bringing in drugs, they are rapists, although, I love this, some I assume are okay people. So I went into a rant on Special Report that night, and I said, he's not going to go anywhere. He stands for nothing but know-nothing xenophobia. Well, I wasn't at the time aware of Trump's habit for tweeting. I became aware of it later that night. So he went into a Twitter storm. I tried to write down the adjectives, but I can't find it here. But oh yes, he called me a loser, a dummy, overrated, etc. That was all actually quite fine. But the final one, which I sort of imagine in my fevered mind, he wrote in pajamas at 2 in the morning, was he retweeted something my publisher had put out 2 weeks earlier when I put out the paperback version of my book. So he tweets the following: Charles Krauthammer's Things That Matter, now out in paperback. Book sucks. I have to admit, it was the most succinct review I had ever got. And I called my publisher the next day, and I said, if we do another edition, I want to wipe the back cover clean. I don't want any of the blurbs. I want one blurb on the back. Book sucks, Donald J. Trump. Coming to a bookstore near you. But when looking back, there's one theme I think that we shouldn't overlook. There's the demographics of what he does. There's kind of the socioeconomics of what he does. But I think the major reason he's had appeal, continues to, and could very well win the presidency, is because he intuited the idea that what the country is looking for is strength. If you listen to any of his speeches, and again, you do have real lives, so you can let me do it for you. He will use the word strength every 20 seconds. Country needs to have strength. I have strong. We need strong borders. We need strong trade policies. We need strong this and that. And we need victories. He's often said, you're going to have so many victories under me, your head will spin, or something to that effect. And that's why he admires Vladimir Putin. He's even expressed sneaking admiration for the butchers of Tiananmen Square for putting down the student revolt in 1989. And that's what he appeals to. And to me, it was the key to understanding his otherwise inexplicable appeal to evangelicals. Ted Cruz's entire strategy was to win evangelicals in the South by a wide margin, and that would propel him into the Midwestern states and the Western states. He didn't. With one exception, I no longer remember which state it was. Trump won the evangelicals in every primary we went up against Cruz, and he won it often with large margins. Now, why is that? He obviously is not one of them the way Cruz is. Normally, when you want to win a constituency in an election, you appeal to them and you try to show commonalities that you share with them. In fact, Trump tried that. He gave a speech at Liberty University, which is a Christian college, a memorable speech. Again, you don't remember it, but I do. So he gives this speech, and in the middle of it, to ingratiate himself to the crowd, he quotes scripture. And he said, he said, now this is from 2 Corinthians. He obviously is so estranged from the tradition he was appealing to that he didn't know that it's 2 Corinthians. Now here I couldn't help myself. Trump does this to me, and I confess, I am weak of flesh. So that night, unprovoked, I rarely tweet. It's true. I simply tweeted out, 2 Corinthians walk into a bar. I would say it was my finest hour. But to return to my theme, what he was telling the evangelicals and what won him the vote is that in the very next sentence, he said something that was actually sort of odd. He said, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to protect Christianity. He talked about the persecution in the Middle East, but he also meant the way that secularists, particularly in the last 8 years, have been squeezing out religious folks and intruding on religious liberties in the name of all kinds of other supposed values. And he basically said, okay, I'm not one of you. We all know that. I'm not a choir boy. But I will be a centurion standing outside the cathedral, patrolling with a truncheon and a gun, and I will try to protect you. That was the appeal. Nobody mistook him for an evangelical as much as he tried to quote scripture. And that, I think, is the metaphor for Trump's appeal. That I'm going to go out there, the country's in decline, is being disrespected. I will do what it takes on trade, on immigration, on the border, on ISIS, on whatever. Now, whether or not you believe you can do it, I'm skeptical. That's not the point. The point is to try to understand the appeal. And for a country that has been governed by a president who has chosen to put us into decline, that is the sort of antithesis, and that is the refreshing recovery from it. Just about every presidential election after 2 terms is a reaction to the presidency before. Jimmy Carter, I won't lie to you, after Nixon. You know, you get all of these complete reactions, and that's Trump's genius. The sense that the country has been weak, in retreat, at home and abroad, and that he's going to bring strength. Well, so that explains, I think, sort of the dynamics of the race. I'm not going to predict who's going to win, because I predicted that Trump had less chance of winning his nomination than Sanders did of winning his. You know, and on Fox, on the special report, we had a candidate casino every Friday night where we would go to an imaginary casino and put money on the candidates. Well, I lost my shirt on the Republican side because I refused to put any money on Trump until it was essentially over. That was a kind of a protest on my part. But I made it all back on the Democratic side because I never put a dime on Bernie Sanders. So I got that right. So here we are, the two most unpopular candidates, no conservative in the race. I think more than any other time in our history, the election is going to hinge on the debate. Because look at this from Hillary's point of view. You all know it's pretty obvious that Trump is on the rise, she is in decline. She's still ahead. If the election were held today, she'd win, narrowly. But if the trends continue, she will lose. And the debate is the one place where that can be decided. Now, her problem is because she doesn't have a program. She said in a speech last week, I have 38 points on my website, 38 proposals. I've never heard anything so flat in my life. Who cares how many you have? Who's going to look it up on the web anyway? After all, you have real lives, don't you? And just to list them doesn't say anything. She doesn't have a lot to say for herself. All of her ads, you might have noticed, are negative ads on Trump. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but she's got me, actually, in one of her ads, which has not made me popular with the Fox audience. It's an ad about Trump being too reckless to be entrusted with nuclear weapons. So they have 3 or 4 other folks, some of whom are rather well known, and it ends with me telling Bill O'Reilly, of all people, that I don't think that Trump can or should be trusted with nuclear weapons. And it's actually very cleverly cut, because as soon as I say that, they cut to O'Reilly, who goes like this, oh. Which I know meant that he was sort of appalled by me, but it looks as if he was endorsing what I said. So it's a very effective ad, and it's earned me tremendous hate mail. I've had to explain to people that no, I didn't authorize it, and no, I'm not getting paid. Although, given how many times I've seen it on the air, I should be. I could retire. So you've got these two candidates, and her strategy has been to demonize him, right? He's unstable, he's untested, he's unfit. That's the theme of every ad. Now, what she's done is she's set this up completely wrong, because she's so lowered expectations that if Trump can go on stage and hold his own for 90 minutes without frothing at the mouth and tweeting at her, he wins the debate. I mean, I really do think this is going to hinge entirely on whether he can control himself for 90 minutes, which I will admit is a dubious proposition. But it is doable. And she has set herself up where it's entirely in his hands. So I think Monday night you really should watch, even though you do have real lives. It's going to be quite extraordinary. Let me just end by putting this in a perspective. We're running the first non-ideological election in a very long time. You go back just 2 years ago to the midterm. You go back 6 years ago to the 2010 midterm. Those were extremely ideological elections in the sense that it was classic left versus right. Obama presidency has been one of liberal overreach from the very beginning. And Obama was truly punished at the polls in 2010 when he lost the House, which meant that he no longer controlled the Congress. And after that, he never was able to enact any significant piece of liberal legislation. He did, of course, Obamacare in the first 2 years. And then he suffered a second shellacking in 2014. Why was that? Because he way overreached on his mandate. And he governed not as a liberal, but really as a social democrat. You know what a liberal is. A liberal is somebody who doesn't care what you do as long as it's mandatory. But, but Obama has governed, and I sort of understood this from the very beginning, from his first State of the Union address in 2009, when he said he didn't come, essentially said, he didn't say it in these words, he didn't come to reform, to tinker around the edges of American society. He came to change it fundamentally, and he was going to do it in very specific ways. And that's what he set out to do with Obamacare, with the reform of the financial system. Think of it, Obamacare is 1/6 of the economy, and he managed to completely ruin it in one piece of legislation. That's not easy to do, but he did it. But he's extremely ambitious in that way. I mean, when people ask me what's a social democrat, there's only one way to explain it, because he's very much like Obama, like a European social democrat. Not a traditional American one which believes in gradual reform, but the kind of social democracy. Obama has spoken openly about this, for example, that he believes that health care should be nationalized the way it is in Europe, but he had to settle for Obamacare, which is a halfway house. But the way to explain what a social democrat is, it's a story told about Churchill. You know, he lost the election after the Second World War. Clement Attlee becomes prime minister. He's the leader of the Labour Party, Socialist Labour Party. One day Churchill goes to the men's room in the House of Commons. They're standing alone. There's nobody else, and one of the urinals is Clement Attlee. Don't worry, that's as weird as it gets. Churchill then deliberately walked to the very far end of the men's room, to a urinal 15 stalls down. And Attlee looks over and says, "Feeling a bit standoffish today, are we, Winston?" Churchill looks over and says, "Not at all, my dear Clement. It's just that every time you see something large, you want to nationalize it." That's why I love talks like this. This is stuff I can't say on TV. Churchill also once said of Attlee that he was a sheep in sheep's clothing. But that's neither here nor there. I just wanted to share it with you before leaving. Barack Obama influenced our political system because whenever he saw large things, he wanted to nationalize them. He wanted to nationalize energy, but even that was a bridge too far. When he tried to pass cap and trade, even in a Congress controlled by Democrats, he had the House and the Senate, it failed. He wanted to nationalize higher education. He has not succeeded in doing that. But he did succeed in nationalizing health care. And I can assure you in the next 4 years, when Obamacare collapses under its own weight, we're going to have a choice. The Democrats are going to say we have no choice now but to do national health care on the Canadian system, or to go back to a market-based system of the kind that Republicans are working on in the House. But Obamacare, as it is now, will not survive. But that's the context of these 6 years. Obama comes in, he's quite by American standards, not European standards, quite a radical reformer, does not succeed in his entire agenda, succeeds in enough of it to create tremendous backlash. Obamacare is what led to the shellacking he took in 2010 and to the shellacking he took in 2014. But oddly enough, it is not an issue in this campaign. The whole Obama agenda is not an issue. It's all about personality. It's all about strength. It's all about populism. It's all about identifying with certain constituencies. I don't think this is going to be the norm. I think we will soon revert to the traditional classical left-right elections that we have had ever since the New Deal. But this is a unique election in a unique time. And you would think, given our history, that the Republicans have all the advantages. After all, every time since 1952, with only one exception, that a party's been in power for 2 terms, it gets kicked out. That's been true except for 1988 for 60 years. And also by the Gallup, if you look at the self-identification by ideology, the majority of Americans are not liberal. They're 20% liberal, 40% conservative, give or take, 35% moderate. Now you'll notice there's another 5%. They have no idea what's going on. Of course, and they determine the elections. So we have no guidelines, no ideological roadmap for this election. And we don't know where we're going to end up ideologically if Trump wins. If she wins, if Hillary Clinton wins, we know where we're going to go, down the path that Obama started in a kind of an unwavering way. But with Trump, we don't really know. So I am left sort of hanging in the balance. I've been asked what I'm going to do, and I don't think I will tell you because we are not, I mean, it would take an hour to discuss it, but I could not vote for Hillary Clinton, and I can't vote for Donald Trump. So I've got problems. Because under our system, they're really, and Gary Johnson will not do either, I'm afraid. We had him on special report, or we were interviewing him. We do this thing called center seat. And I had the first question, and I said, because I know he's in the business, I said, when was the last time you smoked marijuana? And he said, 5 weeks ago, which is a very honest and open. I kind of like the guy, because I think he's in Colorado and works on the edibles. I think that's one of, but I had this notion that, you know, when the red phone rings and you go down to the situation room, I'm not a Puritan and all that, but should have a bit of a clear head. So I'm in a dilemma. I don't know what I'm going to do when I go into the voting booth, but I'll have to improvise. But I will leave you with one thought, which is even though this is a difficult year, and I'm not very happy with either candidate, I do think in the end, our country finds its way. I think it's important to look beyond the 4 years. Whatever happens, there will be an election in 2020. I think we will revert the way we always have to the classic debates between left and right, given the demographics, given the fact that conservatives, as you know at the Washington Policy Center, have the answers, or the ones that are practical, humane, and the ones that work. In the end, I think the country will revert back, and we will find our way. In part, this is sort of a providential feeling I have. Well, I must say, in part because I hate to leave my audience depressed, which I often. Sometimes I give a talk, and at the end, there's weeping and moaning from the back of the room. Handkerchiefs are pulled out. I feel the only thing I can do, sort of as a decent gesture, would be to offer to write prescriptions for antidepressants. Anybody who needs them. But I'd like to cure you rhetorically rather than pharmacologically. And that is very simply this. I'm not a religious man, but I am struck by something near providential about American history. I mean, think of how improbable our history is. The late 1770s were this tiny island of civilization, hard by the wilderness, 3,000 miles away from Europe, and we produced the greatest generation of political genius in the history of man. 19th century, and incidentally, they gave us documents which were so enduring and so wise that it lasted 250 years. We are still on our first republic. The French are on their fifth. Now, the reason I had to say that is because I cannot go a full hour without mocking the French, at least once. So, forgive me. That was just, it was one of my urges. I had to go with it. 19th century, we needed a Lincoln to bind our wounds. We got a Lincoln. 20th century, we needed FDR to get us through the Depression. and to win the Second World War. Second half of the 20th century, we needed Reagan to bring us back from where we were post-Vietnam, to win the Cold War and restore our strength and our self-confidence. No, I don't sit around dreaming for another FDR or another Reagan, but I do think the explanation for what I just enumerated is that it is not so much that we have great talent. To me, it comes from the fact that maybe not the hand of God, but just the bedrock sense of decency, common sense, wisdom, generosity, and love of liberty in the American people. That is the only explanation for the fact that we're able to redeem and recover. Churchill once said, the Americans always do the right thing after having tried everything else first. So we are trying everything else, but in the end we will do the right thing. Thank you very much. Thank you.